U.S. President Donald Trump says he's working to reverse what he called the ruinous policies of the previous U.S. administration. Speaking via video link to political and business leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, he said he pulled America out of the Paris Climate Accord because it was one-sided and unfair. He repeated his call for NATO members to boost defense spending to 5% of GDP. And he gave few details on his plan to end the war in Ukraine, but did say that China and OPEC countries could play a pivotal role. Trump also doubled down on his pledge to use tariffs to boost domestic manufacturing. Now here's some of Trump's first major international speech of his second presidency.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt.
DW's correspondent Ben Fajzullin is reporting from the World Economic Forum. I asked him how these threats of tariffs went down in Davos.
Almost everyone here, Claire, will be against it. Most investors, politicians and business leaders here are for free trade. And that's what they've been working for over the past years, decades, to really try to bring about more competition and level the playing field. But Trump and his allies, other leaders here as well, echoing his calls for a golden age and to really turn things upside down. Whether or not this is just a threat, as Donald Trump, the deal maker, tries to pressure and bully others into following his way of business, or whether or not this brings about prosperity, as he says, to make his country wealthier again and to make the world a more peaceful place through his policies. He was talking about lowering the oil price, for example, to stop the war in Ukraine. He took credit for bringing about peace now with a ceasefire in the Middle East. His threats of tariffs, though, could backfire. Many countries and many companies quite worried about where they're going to be able to produce and manufacture, if they're going to have to shift or not, and whether or not counter tariffs will be placed on America.
Well, this will all be something that is surely being taken very seriously in the halls of power. How are European leaders, for example, trying to future-proof against these tariffs?
There are lots of ideas being thrown about, not just retaliatory responses, but also more investment in Europe when it comes to data centers, for example, and AI to keep up with the $500 billion investment that Mr. Trump has flagged with private investment, but also working more together and creating what the European Union plans, a capital market that is EU-wide. That was something that was also echoed by the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, and also talked about by the European Commission President. So there's a lot that needs to be done in the background here, not only working together, but also bringing down regulation. Business leaders would like to see Germany try to relax its idea of debt and raising debt, or rather how adverse the Germans are to using debt. What we could see, though, on the other side of the Atlantic in America is that debt starts ballooning if all of these tax promises, these tax cuts are introduced. We could also see inflation as a result moving up, and the world has just got to a better place with inflation coming down somewhat and global growth starting to return to its pre-pandemic levels.
Well, thank you so much for that update. That is DW's correspondent Ben Fajzullin in Davos.
Thank you, Claire.
And now let's speak to David Salvo, Managing Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. Welcome. Trump sees the United States as being on the losing side of the current international order that the U.S. built, and that is a position shared by Russia and China. Do you think we could see them now working together in reshaping the world as we know it?
Well, I'd pause before we jump to conclusions that Russia, China, and the United States are going to work together to reshape the world order. I think ultimately Russia and China still see the United States as the world hegemon, and both have a vested interest in pushing back against U.S. hegemony. I'm not convinced that suddenly you're going to find a new axis of partnership between these three countries. I think there's still, primarily an adversarial relationship between the United States and both Russia and China, despite President Trump's interest in developing, a close personal rapport with both leaders. There are always going to be major sticking points that drive the United States and Russia and China apart.
Now, if we look just at Russia and China, those two have been vowing to deepen their ties. What do you think their partnership could achieve, and what kind of risks does it pose to the Trump administration?
Well, we've already seen over the last few years how China is doing a significant job propping up the Russian war machine by providing dual-use technology that Russia can leverage to ensure that its troops have munitions and equipment to fight its war of aggression against Ukraine. So, we've seen the manifestation of that partnership. There have been closer energy ties, closer technology ties, even to some extent closer people-to-people ties between the two countries. And it's rooted in a shared authoritarian affinity between President Putin and President Xi. They want to push back against sort of the global democratic, the liberal international order that has been led by the United States over the last 70 to 80 years. So I don't see that abating, even if there is, I wouldn't call it normalization, but maybe a lowering of temperature between Washington and Beijing and Moscow.
Now, Trump says he thinks that China can help stop the war in Ukraine. I'm curious how feasible you think that is, and on what terms it would be, what it would mean for Kyiv.
Yeah, I think ultimately Russia is going to be the main player that decides the fate of what happens in Ukraine, unfortunately. That's not to say that President Xi doesn't have President Putin's ear. He does, but I think unless Russia escalates in Ukraine to a degree that even China couldn't stomach, say, the use of chemical, biological weapons, or God forbid, nuclear weapons, that might be the moment at time in which China really tries to lean on Russia to bring an end to hostilities. Otherwise, I think, sadly, we're going to be looking at Russia to call the shots. And I don't even think the United States is going to have a ton of leverage here. And I don't think Russia has a vested interest in reaching a near-term solution, a peaceful solution to this war in Ukraine. I just don't think the war is going to end anytime soon because Russia doesn't want it to.
Looking at another scenario, if Trump were successful in brokering a Ukraine-Russia deal, would that in any way diminish the relationship between China and Russia?
Yeah, I've heard this line of thinking. I just don't think this is Henry Kissinger's 1970s, where triangulation between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing is going to lead to the same sort of global dynamics that it did 40, 50 years ago. I think there's more that binds Russia and China together at this moment in time than any perceived personal relationship that President Trump might have or thinks he might have with President Putin, President Xi. There's, ultimately China is, the rising power that is pushing back against American hegemony. Russia's a declining power, but it too has an interest in working with China to offset American influence. And both countries are doing that across the globe. They're doing that in Latin America. They're doing that in Europe. They're doing that in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. So, this is a global phenomenon. I don't see that ending, even if there is, a slight warming of personal ties between the leaders of these countries.
Well, David, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights there. It's David Salvo from the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
And I'm now very pleased to welcome Stormy-Annika Mildner, director of the Aspen Institute in Berlin, Germany. Thank you so much for taking the time. Trump has accused the European Union of treating the U.S., what he calls, very unfairly on trade. Do you think this is the start of a very difficult relationship?
So I would say we already had a difficult relationship during the first Trump administration. But let me also underline that we have had a very beneficial economic relationship between the United States and the EU through trade, through investment, through European companies producing in the US and vice versa, and also employing a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic. So whatever is going to happen with regards to tariffs and interrupting this beneficial relationship, mutual beneficial relationship, is going certainly to hurt both sides.
Well, if he does go ahead with these tariffs as planned, what will the immediate impacts of his presidency be on European interests?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, European companies are exporting a lot from here to the United States. So products would become more expensive. That would have an effect on demand for European products in the US market. European products would become less competitive, but also European companies would also pass along those costs to consumers on the US market, which could then also push up prices and inflation. So that would be also costly for the United States. European companies would not only be affected through the direct channel, through trade and then through tariffs, but we would also be affected through tariffs between Mexico and the United States and Canada, because a lot of European and German companies are producing and also trading with all three countries. And the third channel would be also an indirect one. If there are increasing tariffs between the United States and China, there would also be trade diverting effects, and more products could come to the European market, maybe also be dumped on the European market from China, which would create a more unlevel playing field here. And then again, depending on how the EU reacts with counter tariffs, this would also affect European companies here on the European market. So there are many different challenges and many different channels through which Europe would be affected. But one thing is certain, it would create costs for companies.
And let's talk a little bit more about Russia and China, which you've mentioned. Amid this U.S. unpredictability under the new Trump administration, those two countries are deepening their ties. What risks does that pose for Europe?
So there are several studies from the IMF, which calculated the cost for Europe of a more fragmented world. And the cost would be considerable. And also Europe, because we are so integrated in world markets, would also really struggle from a world which is less rules-based and would have a hard time to really function in a world which is more power-based than rules-based. So that would be a big challenge for the EU, but it could also be the moment, the wake-up call, so to say, for the EU to look at its own competitiveness, to do the reforms which are necessary anyways, which we should have done a long time ago, to complete the internal single market, because there's still a lot to do, which should have been done no matter what happens in the world. It would be good for us to integrate further. And these are all things we could and we should now do with more speed. Reforms internally, work on our competitiveness, internal investment, deal with education, deal with infrastructure investment. So we have lots to do.
Are there areas where EU leaders have already made changes in anticipation of the new Trump administration?
Well, one of the things more on the diplomatic side, though, is that unlike 2016, 2017, I would say that you and also German policymakers and leaders are a lot better prepared. They have tried to reach out to Republicans as well and create more ties. There are also a lot more ties now to the states. On the state level, a lot of policy is made on the state level. So I would say in that sense, Europe is better prepared than last time. But on another level, I would say what I also tried to say in my last answer is that we need to work a lot more on our own strengths and competitiveness, also on security issues, invest a lot more in defense. And in that term, I would say we are not so much better off than in 2016. And we have a lot of work to do to be resilient and also to be competitive.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights with us. That is Stormy-Annika Mildner, director of the Aspen Institute here in Berlin.
Thank you so much.
Let's speak now to Wyne. He is a senior research and advocacy advisor for US-China relations with the International Crisis Group and joins me now from Washington, D.C. Ali, great to have you on the show. So, President Trump has said that China could help end the war in Ukraine. What's your take on that?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program. I'm not optimistic. The United States, under the Biden administration and now under the Trump administration in its first few days, has been prevailing upon China to exert its leverage, its economic leverage, its diplomatic leverage to compel Russia to scale back its aggression. Thus far, those efforts have not borne fruit. And I think that, China's conviction is, or at least, my sense of its conviction is, that even if China were to do a 180 on its position vis-a-vis Russia and were to come out tomorrow and say, we denounce Russian aggression, we want to partner with the United States, I think the assessment of Chinese leaders is that even that about face wouldn't change the fundamental thrust of U.S. policy towards China. So China's feeling is, why lose an important economic and diplomatic partner if we don't stand to gain any benefits in the process?
We'll come back to the point of US policy on China in a second. But Trump also talked about working with Beijing and Moscow to achieve nuclear arms reductions. In fact, he said, quote, we'd like to see denuclearization. So Trump claims to have a good relationship with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So will he use that to achieve this goal?
I think he'll certainly try. I would say I would sort of answer in two parts. I think that on the objective of denuclearization, I think as commendable as the objective is, I don't think that trilateral nuclear arms reduction, I don't think that it's feasible. I think in part because we are in an era of intensifying a strategic competition. The United States, China, Russia, for various reasons, believe that they need to increase and modernize their nuclear arsenals. But to the first part of your question, there's no question that President Trump has an affinity for President Xi. He has long touted their friendship. He continues to do so. And so I will expect that when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, President Trump is going to center his personal rapport and rebuilding his rapport with President Xi as a centerpiece of recalibrating imbalances that he believes exist in the bilateral relationship.
It's an interesting one, Ali, because at the same time, Trump has threatened to impose tariffs on Chinese imports. So what can China actually do to avoid that scenario?
I think that there's very little that China can do to prevent President Trump from imposing tariffs. And it's important to keep in mind that although there's a lot of talk about a potential renewed trade war between the United States and China, President Trump isn't only focused on China, he's also focused on imposing tariffs on U.S. allies and partners, such as Canada and Mexico. And President Trump, dating back to at least the 1980s when there was a lot of concern in the United States about Japan, President Trump for decades now has believed that tariffs are an instrument for addressing bilateral economic imbalances. So I don't think that China is going to be able to do much to avert tariffs. What China can do, and I think what it's better prepared to do than it was 8 years ago, it now has more tools, more retaliatory tools, whether it is restricting the exports of certain critical minerals, whether it is launching investigations into U.S. companies that have substantial business operations inside of China. I think that China feels now, vis-a-vis 8 years ago, it's more economically capable, it's more central to the global economy, and so I think that we will feel more confident about pushing back if and when President Trump imposes tariffs.
And with regards to China, how do you see the whole situation with Taiwan playing out?
So I don't see any immediate sign that China is preparing to invade Taiwan. And I think that China recognizes that staging an amphibious landing, it's arguably the most complicated military maneuver there is. It would be fraught with risk. There are many ways in which it could go wrong. And if the United States and China were to end up in a full-fledged armed confrontation over Taiwan, the devastation that China's economy would incur, the devastation that China's military would incur, would span for generations. My sense is that China is going to continue what it's been doing up until now, which is waging a multifaceted pressure campaign to tighten the noose around Taiwan, staging more military maneuvers in Taiwan's periphery, working to co-opt political elites in Taiwan, working to deepen economic and people-to-people linkages between the mainland and Taiwan. So I think it's more about continuing this multifaceted pressure campaign, essentially to grind down Taiwan psychologically. But I don't see any signs that China is preparing for an imminent invasion of Taiwan.
Now, just one final one, which is sort of moving away from the issue directly of China. We touched on it a little earlier. Now, Trump has said that he wants to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin immediately. Now, you said it there before that you weren't particularly optimistic. But would a meeting with Vladimir Putin, do you think, move things along with regards to the war in Ukraine? Do you think that it would result in perhaps an end to that war, perhaps quicker than it may have been under a different president?
Here too, I'm unfortunately not optimistic. If anything, I think that President Putin, in order to seem as though he is more integrated into the international system, that he's not isolated, I think that he would actually welcome a meeting with President Trump. He would welcome the opportunity to be seen as getting the attention of the newly elected, or I should say the re-elected president of the world's foremost power. But my sense is that President Putin feels that time is on his side. He feels that, especially with the re-election of Donald Trump, that the possibility of transatlantic cohesion in pushing back against further Russian aggression is diminishing. So my sense is that President Putin feels that despite the losses that Russia is incurring in terms of military personnel, sanctions, and so forth, I think he feels that time is on his side, but I think that he would welcome an opportunity to meet with President Trump to elevate his own stature in the international system.
Ali, it's always great to get your take on what's going on in the world, and of course, particularly with US-China relations, but also tonight with Russia too. Ali Wyne, a senior research and advocacy advisor for US-China relations with the International Crisis Group. Thanks for joining us tonight from Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much, Pablo.